Hey, welcome to a special Mother's Day episode of Dispatches. Hollie has always has the world's greatest vignettes about human stories, and this week we're going to concentrate on a couple of them. Motherhood in El Salvador, motherhood in Darfur, and just how hard it can be in some parts of the world to actually be a mom. And then we'll turn our attention to something more first world and talk about Mother's Day from a personal perspective. So let's start off with just how hard being a mom can be in some parts of the world. Let's go to El Salvador, what, 40 years ago?
Yeah, let me just preface by saying I think it was the Dalai Lama who said when you know what triggers you in life, that's what part of you needs healing. And so maybe this is the part of me that needs healing, but I think the social media and the algorithms that come, constantly portraying the challenges of motherhood, and certainly there are um, many challenges, and I don't want to take away from that. But I think, just my perspective in working in many places, I also want to recognize a point. uh, It's a touchy. It's always hard to do it because you're going to upset somebody. But in short, I want to recognize how fortunate we do have it here, in that there are ambulances to call, there are hospitals to go to. You have choice in whether you want to have your child at home with a midwife, or you want to go to a hospital, or there are options, is what I'm saying. And it certainly, things very much vary depending on where you live, socioeconomic status, and all of that. Don't get me wrong, but just being in a country that is a first world country is really an incredible luxury compared to what I've seen in many parts of the world, and the challenges of motherhood that come with, without the help, without the support, with extreme poverty. But there's also a lot of beauty in that. So I've actually been working on a larger project, really looking into this, and I wanted to use Mother's Day as a way to kind of bring some of these vignettes to life, and the stories of mothers that we don't often hear about. These aren't the stories that are going to come up in your TikTok algorithms, and they're not something that will ever sort of flash across headline news. But to me, there's so much to be learned from stories of mothers in crisis and conflict. And these are just sort of a few of the many stories that I really want to share in the near future. Um, and El Salvador being one of them. I think a lot of us are not really aware of the civil war that happened in El Salvador during the 80s, and just the level of brutality, um, and how that plays into the border crisis that we are sort of dealing with still today, and MS-13 and these other gangs. So I kind of think that often in telling the stories of these wars through the eyes of mothers is a way to, I think, see it very differently than just reading a textbook or listening to a very sanitized or dry media report. So several years ago, I spent some time in El Salvador, specifically in a place called El Mozote, and that was very much a rebel stronghold. And the government, which was targeting these rebel groups at the time, calling them Marxists and socialists, um, really did some horrific things in what became known as an El Mozote massacre, which just slaughtered hundreds of people just indiscriminately. And it wasn't just the murder, it was sort of the sexual violence, it was the torture, it was just honestly some of the most horrific stories that I've heard in my duration of doing this kind of work. And I had the fortune of meeting with several mothers from Mazote who were still living in Mazote, who shared their stories with me, being young mothers at the time that this war broke out. And it just really brought home to me how incredible mothers are, and the lengths that mothers will go to save and protect their children. And in some of these vignettes, I wanted to just really bring that to the surface. And I think that um, they can be hard reads. This is certainly a hard read, but a really important read if you want to see what war does and how it can bring out the best and the worst of of human beings.
Yeah. So this El Salvador one, so I remember, uh, you know, that whole thing going down, and how, the assassination, the precipitated the whole.
The priest being
Yeah,
killed.
yeah, and yeah, because that was big news at the time, right?
Yeah,
And
Archbishop Monsignor Oscar Romero.
yeah, yeah, and so he, when he was killed, and then uh the villagers essentially rose up. And at the time the government was quite oppressive, and but the fact of the matter is, um in all wars, both sides start to sweep up and break up families. And in the story that you wrote, part of it is that her son was taken from her and
Mm.
forcibly put into one of these resistance fighter groups. And,
Yeah, so this story, it's I wanted to highlight the story. Maria, she was a 32-year-old mother living a very quiet life up in the mountains. It's a beautiful area of El Salvador. And I wanted to tell her story because it's not really a matter of good versus bad, whichever way you look at it. Um, I should preface in saying that the US was largely supporting the government of El Salvador, and that was a point of contention because the crimes that the government troops were committing were horrific against a civilian population, and that was being supported by then the Reagan administration. And I know there's a lot of Reaganites out there, but that, to me, this was a very dark period, to be honest, and definitely brought into question responsibilities in funding some of these foreign troops. At the time, there was a huge threat of, um, or a perceived threat of communism and socialism, and certainly El Salvador at that point could have tipped that way. And so the war itself was very much about the capitalism versus socialism dynamic in Latin America. And this particular priest was assassinated because he was very much an outspoken advocate for the poor. He was a very strong critic of government violence. And so he was assassinated by somebody that was connected to the Salvadorian military and right wing death squads that sort of opposed his point of view. And so that was the sort of the tipping point in 1980 that spiraled into this horrific war. Um, but Maria's story sort of again highlights someone who was just a civilian who wanted no part of either of this. And of course, in her area, that was the area, Mazote, that was being targeted by government forces. But at the same time, Maria also suffered as a result of the rebel forces because they basically forcibly recruited her teenage son. And there was a lot of child soldiers involved in this. And I remember Maria recalling how the opposition insurgents, they would just come to her door all the time, and, demand corn, demand beans, demand bread. And even though she could barely feed her own children, this young mother is giving them basically everything that they ask for on the premise. And the commanders had promised her that they would stop trying to forcibly recruit her only son. And Maria took them for her word. She figured, I'll give you everything you ask for, and you'll in return leave my family alone, essentially. But it was a Sunday morning, and she went out to visit her family at a nearby village. And her husband went down to the river for a bath. Remember, these are poor people; they don't even have running water in their homes. And at that time, that's when the guerrillas basically stormed her home and took her 14-year-old son, Eugenio, to their training camp. And of course, when Maria found out, she was absolutely devastated. She climbed the hill. She, went straight to them and said, "You promised." Went to the commander that had made those promises for 2 years and said, I gave you everything I had. I gave you food. Now you've broken our agreement. And basically, the commander didn't care. He said that Hassan couldn't leave, and that wars were not won with bread and corn. They will only be won with farmers taking arms and fighting back. So that just shows you really how challenging it is for civilians, and what a horrible situation to have, to be a mom and to be in that position. And she just, the last, basically the last words that she had for her son was, when you get the chance, just run, desert the army, save yourself. um, but her son, even at that age, basically said to her, if I leave, they will come and kill all of you. And so that is just a huge burden for a child to bear. And again, we can't look at these conflicts as black or white, because they're not. There's so much more nuance. And I think in this story alone, you start to see some of that nuance in war. And if you want to sort of find out what happened to Maria, what happened to Eugenio, and a little bit about this conflict that really does impact policy in the United States today, then please go and check out that Substack,
Yeah. And
because it only
so
got. I don't want to scare anyone, but what else Maria went through as a mom um, is also horrific, beyond just what her son Eugenio being recruited to these groups, but then what happened, and what happens when there is a lack of medical care on the ground. And Maria's story just really encapsulates so many things. And I think this is in large part why I do the work I do, is more, I just see that through through the eyes of an individual story, we can learn so much more about that macro picture, rather than thumbing through statistics and um, sanitized reports. I think that when we learn about conflict and crisis through individual stories, um, there's so much more brevity to it. It's such an easier way to digest the facts and figures.
oh yeah, well, so when I read that story, being, you know, heavily more on the um surrounding policy and politics side of things, the first thing that hit me going, yeah, it's El Salvador, and I go like, who was running the South American National Security Council desk at the time? And the answer is Oliver North. So, so to put it into context of, where this fits in the puzzle of how people understand the history of U.S. policy in the Americas. That's your Washington think tank touch point is, here you are. This is one of the things that happened during that time. No fault on her side, and eventually the army actually won, and that's how the massacre occurred. And but this is all the very delicate balance of U.S. policy, and the consequences are always on the individuals. And so this is, I think, when you add the context of it and say, how does national policy impact individual lives, this is a very good story to bear in mind as someone reads through it and go like, yeah, this is what was going on. uh, Eventually the press concentrated on things like Iran Contra and other stuff that they were also coming out of that desk at the NSC. But yeah, these are the consequences of um global power projection. um I think it was a very powerful story, and particularly when you put it in the context of U.S. history. Let's turn to Darfur, which is and the context there is where El Salvador was a very concentrated U.S. policy involvement. Darfur seems to just be an example of U.S. or global neglect, but the effects on the individuals are still the same. So let's just discuss a little bit more about your story about, you know, the
Yeah.
camps.
I mean, Darfurian mothers are just Oh my goodness, some of the most incredible human beings that I've certainly ever encountered. Um, just just let me paint a picture. You've got so many women that are widowed because the RSF, the militia group, or the Janjaweed, targeting men and boys. And so you have mothers. This is a sort of a culture that will often have where the male will have five wives. And even when they don't have a lot of money, it's this status symbol to have as many children as possible. So they can even divorce a wife and take another wife. So it's not that uncommon to hear of a man who has maybe 100 children. It's very different to the world that we know here in the United States. But in any case, the women who oftentimes don't have a huge amount of say in the way that culture is sort of constructed. They may have seven, eight more children, and then they're widowed. They've got no money. They're in a camp. They're trying to chop wood. They've got a baby on their back, another baby on the front. Someone else in sort of their community or village maybe has the other children. They're out there trying to make money. It's the most brutal heat you've ever encountered. You've got mosquitoes. You've got um, just there's no sanitation. There's no running water. There's very little food. They're trying to do whatever they can. Sometimes they've given birth a day ago, and they're still out there. Of course, one beautiful aspect is that they do have this village that we hear about a lot in the US, the quote unquote the village, but it is a very real thing, which I think gets these women through, especially through these challenging times. But really, at the end of the day, if I think I have it hard, I absolutely do not. I look at these women, I'm absolutely in awe of what they're capable of just doing because there's no choice but to do it, but to endure, but to get through. Um, and then you add war on top of it. You add the fact that when women go out to chop wood, they're then very vulnerable to abuse, to capture, to sexual violence. I mean, that's 80% of the sexual violence stories happen because women went out to get wood or water or do something. And that's when they were targeted by these militia groups. So it just seems every step that they make is done with incredible courage because again, they have no other choice. They have to. There is certainly nobody coming to their rescue. There is no man in the home that can go and do a lot of this work. And even if there is a man in the home, in this society, it is women that are still doing a huge amount of labor. Very different to Afghanistan, where women are being forced to stay in home and to cover and to do all of that. In Darfur, women are very much out in the field, basically taking on many, many duties. So they do have it incredibly hard, but they power through. And if you look at this particular excerpt, I want to talk about a mother and daughter that I met at one of the refugee camps and how she had been shot, how she'd been targeted. Um, she'd lost children of her own, and her her bond with her sort of teenage daughter as they're trying to get through these hardships, and just again without any help, they're living in basically this sort of flimsy tent. Again, I preface that the heat, there's no circulation, there's no, there isn't, you're showering with a bucket of water, maybe a couple of times a week if you're lucky. So it's just an incredibly difficult place, and she's injured on top of it. The mum can kind of barely walk. She was shot twice, when RSF fighters basically stormed the home. And this shows you again the brutality of these conflicts when you're targeting a 55-year-old woman who certainly didn't do anything to cause that kind of aggression. But this is what war does. It targets the innocent. And so I wanted to kind of tell a little bit more about this story, basically through the eyes of Fatima, the mother, and her daughter, Madia, because I think through them, we see how just senseless this violence is. And it's hard to say it's not our problem. Okay, maybe what happens in Darfur is not directly affecting you in your life today. But again, it's only through connection that we have compassion. And this is why I want to continue telling these stories because I think it does matter. And this isn't in the story, but it was really upsetting for me today, and again, why there is a lot of contempt against some of these international bodies and international court systems. There was a case that was brought against the UAE for basically arming the RSF and these rebel groups in Darfur. Why are they arming? Because everybody wants a piece of that land. It's very resource rich. There's a lot of gold, a lot of mineral, a lot of things that basically power our lives today. And so there is a lot of outside interest in it. And the only way you can stop a lot of these conflicts is by cutting off that supply route of arms. But this case was, thrown out basically. And that was upsetting to me because there are such little avenues for people to seek some kind of justice, especially against much more rich and powerful countries. And if these international bodies that are set up and supposedly equipped to do this are not even really willing to examine it, then what's the point? Why do they exist? Why are countries funding them if we're not going to have an honest conversation about it?
Yeah. So, well, very good uh point at the end there, that and a very important question. If international bodies that are supposed to be watchdogging this stuff, and international coalitions that are supposed to be looking out for human rights, are in fact that they don't count when it comes to things like, we want those resources, we don't really care what happens to those people because they're in the way of us getting those resources, uh, that brings a question of, this is the kind of stuff that's been going on for what, 5,000 years, right? Of absolutely brutal. It's probably, if you want to talk global stability, the most stable form of international policy over the last 5,000 years is this kind of cruelty. It's stable, it repeats, it is almost impossible to stop, and the human condition is such that we haven't really ever figured out what to do about it. And
Mm.
all
And
of
then
the
we wonder
institutions that we
why
put
we
in.
have a mass immigration, why we have a mass sort of influx of asylum seekers and refugees, and I people most of the time, again, you have economic migrants, which is different, but people don't want to leave their country. This is their home. This is what they love. This is what they know. Um, but you get to a point where if you can only rebuild your house so many times, you can only lose so many family members, you can only be the subject of sexual violence so many times, and then you've got to go. And nobody wants to be a refugee. Nobody wants to go to a foreign country where they're not welcomed, where they have no resources or support. So what more needs to be done to ensure that people can stay in their homes? And that is the underlying, I think, failure of international policy, is that we can look away, but when the problem comes to our doorstep, then it's a problem. But if you could have backtracked several years ago and what steps could have been in place to prevent that from happening, that weren't taken. And I think I just see this over and over again, and it doesn't seem to get fixed or changed. Sure, it's not our business until it is our business.
That's correct. And, well, I mean, I hate to say these people are screwed, but they really are.
Yeah.
And they're screwed, not just because of the local situation, but because there really is, there's no cavalry, there's no help coming, and there's less and less resources being directed in their direction to make life better. So,
Mm.
so but they all have the same dream, right? They want to they want to see a life that looks more like a first world country. And so, for Mother's Day reasons, let's talk about, the contrast of Mother's Day in first world countries, and let's make it personal. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, you and I both live
Yeah,
in
well,
first world
absolutely. I
countries.
think, I mean, there isn't a comparison. And again, I'm so hesitant to, I don't know the right way to articulate this, as I said in the beginning. Um, everybody has their problems, and I never want to take that away from anybody. And everybody's entitled to their hardships and to exploring those. But I think certainly my perspective is in seeing the things that I've seen in different places, it makes me hard. I can never feel, too sorry for myself because, in tough situations, because sure, I may have it harder than somebody else who, maybe has a lot more resources or family or nannies or whatever that may be. And we can go down the dark dungeon of comparison. But at the end of the day, just living in a place with sanitation, with food, with um, medical care accessible to us, that is that is just an incredible luxury that I think we often don't take enough time to appreciate, and how much that would be appreciated in so many of these places where so many women still die in childbirth, where the infant mortality rate is just shockingly high. Um, and we certainly have problems here, but I can't equate it to anything compared to what women go through and just their strength and willingness to endure. And I look at Raven and she's so lucky, just to be where she is and to have access to the things that she has access to the toys, to the last night we were at a baseball game. um, those things are not things that uh, most of the world can get access to. And so I just want to express my own gratitude for the life that I've been lucky enough to live, and growing up in Australia, and just growing up in a place where there was no war. I certainly heard about my grandfather and other people who'd gone to war, but certainly in the environment that I was living in, being incredibly safe and with parents that cared and protected and loved us. And I just think it's a moment of pause and gratitude, because too many children and families don't have that here in the US as well. Um, there are too many children that are growing up in poverty or growing up in abusive homes, and things that are maybe happening right under our nose that we aren't always aware of. And it just brings me back to my, I guess, core philosophy of, you never know what somebody else is going through. And when I see nasty comments online or some kind of horrible rhetoric, I wonder where that came from and why. And it's just the importance of a little bit more kindness. So definitely this Mother's Day, I just have a lot of gratitude for being able to go into motherhood with eh, resources that so many people in the world don't have. And of course, a lot of people are going to have it better than I, but I'm not going to go down that comparison lens, because that is totally pointless. And I'm just blessed to be in the position that I am, and have had the childhood and the mother that I have. And I certainly didn't appreciate her until being a mother myself as well. And so I think having a child really strengthened my relationship with my mother as well, because you suddenly see the sacrifices that maybe you didn't see before. And it's impossible to look at a tiny child and not see yourself as a tiny child, and the mother that took care of you. And so I just think yeah, having a little bit of compassion, because we don't know what other people went through around us, is what I'm taking away this Mother's Day.
All right. Well, so with that, I
Yeah.
think that's a taking from vignettes of other people to a vignette of your own motherhood. I think
Yeah.
that's a very
What
good Mother's Day
and what are you
session.
doing this Mother's Day?
Not much. I mean, it's been for me, m- the process of motherhood in in and what it means to me at the moment is really just admiring how Leslie, as both a mother and a daughter, are dealing with issues that she's going through
Mm.
with her mother. I mean, I lost my mother back in 1986 or 87. It's been a long time. It still hurts because I do miss her. But Leslie is, she's not that well, and that she has her share of medical problems. But even so, she puts so much time into taking care of her aging mother, who at this point has dementia and Alzheimer's and so many things. And so like this is I took her up to her mother's house last weekend. And so the thing about taking Leslie around these days is we go to do all of these chores that have to do with taking care of her mother. Um, and the thing that's always poignant to me is when I'm driving her around and whenever we park and she's getting ready to do all this work, the first thing that we do when we park is we take her little blue uh handicap card, put it on my windshield, and I always remember that, how brave she is for doing everything that she does and how good of a daughter that she is. And then always somewhere along the way, both our daughters will, particularly on a long trip, will call her up in the car. So she's a daughter, a mother, um, and just I'm in admiration, because that's a lot of it's a lot of resilience that it takes to do that. And it's not the same resilience as surviving war zones. It's not the same kinds of decisions of deciding whether or not to leave a country because you think it's too unsafe for your family. My mother went through that choice and
Mm.
decided to come to the United States because it was safer here. But every day it the job doesn't get better. It just goes on. It's a grinding process that lasts your entire life on so many levels. And so I think mothers deserve a great deal more admiration for all of the work that they do because it is one of the hardest jobs in the world.
It is trying to balance a lot of things. It certainly is. And I'm also very mindful, I guess, in these discussions too, um, of a lot of people who maybe want to be mothers, where that is a struggle for many different reasons. So I also want to give space to people in that way as well, because I think it can be very hard to listen to these discussions um, and be in in that particular place. And so I think Mother's Day is hard for many people that have lost their mothers, and people that want to be mothers or wanted to be mothers and were not able to have that opportunity, or it is an ongoing challenge. So I also just want to, yeah, acknowledge that's not far from my thoughts as well.
Yeah. And and to put it all in context as as this thing started off, um all of those problems and all of those uh challenges that we just went over in the very last part of this, we are so lucky to have these first world problems, you know there's just no getting around the fact that we can pay attention to things that go beyond just basically, am I going to get shot tomorrow?
Mm.
Which is something that happens in other parts of the world. And we're lucky. And with that, I think we'll leave it at that thought that, how lucky we are to be here, living our lives and appreciating the fact that our vignettes are so much kinder than the other vignettes that we covered at the beginning of this. So thank you, Holly, and happy Mother's Day to you because you are a
Thank you,
mother now.
Dennis. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, when I first met you, I wasn't sure I'd ever see the day, but here you are.
Yep, here I am.
Yeah, okay. Well, all right. Till next time.
Till next time. Thank you, Dennis.